This recording deals with the presidencies of Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. So Gerald Ford takes over the presidency after Richard Nixon resigns in 1973. And he's the only non-elected vice president and president because Nixon selected him as vice president after his vice president resigned, and then after Nixon resigns, he becomes the president. So he talks about healing the nation after the Vietnam War, after the issues with Watergate. So he decides to pardon Richard Nixon and grants him amnesty, meaning he cannot be prosecuted for the crimes that he committed during the Watergate scandal and cover-up. He doesn't do very much in domestic or foreign affairs because Congress was controlled by Democrats. He's going to try to do his best to deal with the inflation issue and stagflation. And during his time in office, Saigon falls to North Vietnam, and the Vietnamese Civil War is over with North Vietnam winning and communism being instituted there. So one of the reasons that Ford is selected to be Nixon's vice president when his vice president resigns because of allegations of corruption is because he's kind of a very vanilla person and candidate. He doesn't come with much controversy. He does get into controversy when he decides to pardon Nixon because he felt that the country needed to move on. If we didn't pardon Nixon, then eventually he would have been put on a criminal trial, and a former president being on a criminal trial obviously doesn't look good, but also just keeps the Watergate issue alive, and he tries to kind of end the Watergate issue completely. Everybody knows Nixon's guilty, and his punishment is that he can no longer, be the president, and for history, he will always be seen as a corrupt president, but he doesn't want him to go into further prosecution. It proves to be pretty unpopular, though, among the general public and Nixon loyalists still facing prosecution because he only pardons Nixon. He doesn't pardon anybody else involved. And as a result, many Republicans were voted out of office in the midterm elections in 1974, so that limits Ford's ability to do some things while he's president. So this issue with stagflation is continuing from Nixon. Nixon didn't do very much with it because he's preoccupied with Watergate. So Ford comes up with this idea of trying to provide confidence in the economy with the voluntary Whip Inflation Now program, and it's kind of like an idea that states would kind of take this up on their own because he's not much of a federal government interventionist. So he's against government spending, but he supports an increase in unemployment benefits and a tax cut in an effort to help get the economy going. And he's also often at odds with the Democratic-controlled Congress, just like Nixon was for portions of his presidency, and they want him to take more in an active role. And in response, Ford vetoes Congress, or congressional vetoes, created the highest percentage of veto overrides since the 1850s. So clearly, the government is not really getting much done to try to deal with the economic issue of stagflation. Probably the only and largest success of Ford's presidency is the Helsinki Accords that come out of a meeting in Helsinki, Finland in 1975 between both Eastern and Western European nations and the United States. And it set forth basic human rights all nations acknowledge and accept. The Soviets generally ignore them, but at least they kind of get put down on paper. And they sought cooperation between the Soviets and the West to recognize and accept spheres of influence throughout Europe and the world, and trying to make a push for these newly independent nations that are coming out after World War II to be more respected of their own rights by both the Americans and the Soviet Union. So in the election of 1976, Gerald Ford runs against kind of an outsider, Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter, the idea that he was an outsider was very beneficial to him because people in Washington were getting the idea of being corrupt, and it really wasn't going to benefit them. So the problem with Jimmy Carter is that when his experience is mostly in the executive branch at a governor's level, so he has no foreign policy experience. So he's going to have issues that way. He also doesn't like to participate in just consensus politics or party politics, so he's going to alienate a lot of other Democrats because he's not going to go with what he wants to do. So he's going to have a relatively unsuccessful presidency for a lot of reasons, and eventually in the election of 1980, he's going to lose to Ronald Reagan. So he is known for kind of being against the norm of what our former presidents had been. He's an outsider. He has not much foreign policy experience or Washington experience, and he wins by a narrow margin, so neither candidate is all that popular. He has as I said, no national political experience and lacked the ability to win reluctant politicians over on his side. He was kind of hard-headed and was going to do whatever he wanted to do. He's well-liked for his informal approach, but he doesn't get he's not very effective at getting people on his side and building a consensus. So Carter on economic issues is a relatively moderate Democrat, and when he inherits these stagflation issues that have now dogged Nixon, Ford, and now himself Carter, he tries to deal with them by cutting federal spending on social programs, and this angers many liberal Democrats, and the American people don't really see the economy responding, so they start to lose confidence in him. He starts to push for deregulation and removal of federal government controls, which again is a very kind of conservative economic policy, and this angers Democrats as well. So when he wants to do things other than this stuff, they're not really going to be too supportive of him. So as the energy issues and the economic issues continue, Carter kind of brings the idea of having more alternative energy. So he creates a cabinet department, the Department of Energy, to deal with these issues. He wants states to produce oil and gas less, so that states that are known for that really oppose his conservation plans. And the National Energy Act, passed in 1978, incorporated more of Carter's directives, but they're not as successful as he wishes they would be. So he wants alternative energy, whether they be nuclear, solar, wind, but when there is a near disaster in 3 Mile Island in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, on a nuclear power plant, people lose confidence and get afraid of nuclear power, and it's not really incredibly destructive as an event, but the idea of nuclear power being dangerous is far more in people's minds after the event. So his energy policy is not too effective either. So we can see between 1973 under President Nixon and under President Ford's short term, and now under Reagan, gasoline prices are going up very, very fastly, partially because of OPEC and other reasons, but this pushes Americans to buy, as I said yesterday in the Nixon lecture, more foreign cars, Toyota and Honda especially, because American cars are not known for fuel efficiency. So as they look for fuel efficiency, people go outside of the United States to buy their cars, or at least to foreign companies. So both Carter's biggest successes and failures will come on a foreign policy level. His largest success is known as the Camp David Accords, where he brings the Egyptian president and the Israeli prime minister to Camp David, which is the presidential kind of retreat area, and they get a framework for Middle East peace, and it's an important step towards peace in the Middle East between Israel and many Muslim nations. Israel agreed to withdraw from an area that Egypt controlled, and Egypt would become the first Arab country to officially recognize Israel as an independent nation. So it's a big step. It doesn't necessarily last in terms of peace generally, but it's a big step in the right direction for Middle East peace. Although détente was kind of working when Nixon was involved, it doesn't really work as well with Carter, and that's partially because he supports Soviet dissidents in the Soviet Union. He tries to get SALT II to get more limitations on nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, etc., but it doesn't really fall through. They get a framework done, but it is never ratified. Both nations follow it, but it's still seen as somewhat of a failure. During Carter's presidency as well, in 1979, the Soviet Union invades their southern neighbor, Afghanistan. Afghanistan had been in their sphere of influence for a while as part of the Soviet Union, but they decide to rebel against the Soviet Union, and Carter called the invasion a clear threat to peace, and wanted to kind of support some of the issues in Afghanistan. As a result, Carter imposed a boycott on the 1980 Summer Olympic Games to be held in Moscow, and 60 other nations eventually joined. But it's seen as kind of politicizing the Olympics, which doesn't really work out because it's supposed to be, an apolitical event, the Olympics. So again, even when he tries to react, people don't always approve of what he's doing. So the invasion of Afghanistan by the USSR is important to us for a couple of reasons. The group that is fighting in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union is a group known as the Mujahideen, which is a group that is eventually going to kind of go into the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and it'll be led by a guy named Osama bin Laden. So he is fighting against the Afghans, and there is support given to them by the United States to hurt the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union this becomes kind of their Vietnam. It's a country that they don't necessarily understand all the political and social issues going on, and when they invade, they're the big bad country that's going to stop this war and stop the rebellion, but it doesn't work out so well. And they get bogged down for about 10 years in this war, and it is not going to be a success. And it kind of is one of the reasons why the Soviet Union starts to show that there's several cracks in their communist country, and it starts to fall apart. So although we support the Mujahideen while they're fighting the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union eventually leaves in 1989, we kind of leave Afghanistan alone, and there's different rival factions that fight over power in Afghanistan for years. And by 2000, the Taliban, which is a radical Muslim faction, controlled about 90%, and they are going to work with Al-Qaeda eventually, which becomes a major terrorist group against the United States and many Western powers later on. So Carter's biggest issue comes in Iran. So in January of 1979, there was a revolution in Iran, and they kick out the pro-American Shah to replace him with an anti-Western leader, the Ayatollah, who was a religious leader, a Muslim religious leader. So Carter allows the displaced Shah to enter the United States for medical treatment. Khomeini and his followers seize the American embassy in Tehran, Americans' capital, and 52 Americans are taken hostage and moved from place to place over the course of 444 days, and Carter will attempt to get them removed by negotiation. There's also an attempted military helicopter landing, which fails. So Carter is seen as just a complete failure in this case because he can't get these people home for over a year. So every night on the news, the days that these people have been held hostage are being talked about, and Carter is seen as a failure. And obviously it's bad timing because it's 1979, and he is up for re-election in 1980. So by 1980, there is definitely a loss of confidence by many Americans, generally in the federal government, but specifically in Carter. So he runs against somewhat of an outsider, the conservative Republican Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan defeats him by a landslide. In early 1981, following all these different negotiations, Carter is eventually able to get the hostages released, and President Reagan sends Carter to greet them when they arrive home. They are literally released on Inauguration Day in 1981, so Carter is the president that gets them home, but right as Reagan is becoming president of the United States.